The Americas were the last continents humans reached. DNA revealed the journey took far longer than anyone thought. This narrow strait separates two continents. 85 kilometers of cold water between Siberia and Alaska. Little Diomede Island sits in the middle of the strait. You can see Russia from its western shore. In winter, you can almost see the other side, the shortest distance between the old world and the new. Beringia was not a wasteland. It was a productive grassland that supported large herds and the people who hunted them. 20,000 years ago, sea levels exposed a land bridge the size of Alaska, not a narrow crossing, an entire subcontinent of tundra grassland. And on that land bridge, a small population lived in isolation for thousands of years. They hunted mammoth, bison, and caribou, a productive steppe that supported small bands for millennia. Ivory needles, bone spear points, sophisticated tools from a people the textbooks barely mention. They were not crossing a bridge. They were living on a continent. And their DNA proves it. The Beringian standstill model changed everything we thought about the first Americans. The ancestral population spent thousands of years on the land bridge itself, trapped between the massive ice sheets to the east and the ocean to the west, isolated from both Asia and the Americas, long enough to develop the unique genetic signatures found in all Native Americans. Today, genetic variants found nowhere else on Earth, the signature of Beringian isolation. Every Native American alive today descends from this small founding population, a few thousand people at most, the tightest demographic bottleneck of any continental population. Fewer founders than a small town. The entire future population of two continents once fit in a single camp. A few thousand people became the ancestors of every indigenous person from Alaska to Patagonia. But the founding population was not what anyone expected. They were already a mixture, roughly 60% East Asian and 40% ancient North Eurasian. Two deeply divergent populations met and merged in Beringia before anyone reached the Americas. The merger zone was Beringia itself, two populations that had been separated for 20,000 years, 20,000 years apart. Then a few thousand years together on the land bridge, long enough to create something new. The first Americans were already mixed. Purity was never part of the origin story. Then, around 15,000 years ago, the ice began to melt, and the way south opened, the coastal route, a narrow corridor between the ice and the Pacific. The most likely path south, kelp forests, seals, shellfish. The coast provided enough food to sustain the migration. Shell middens along the Pacific coast trace the migration route southward. For decades, the textbook said humans entered the Americas through an inland ice-free corridor roughly 13,000 years ago. The Clovis culture, 13,000 years old, for half a century, considered the first Americans. Clovis sites from coast to coast, a sophisticated culture, but not the first. Clovis hunters specialized in megafauna, mammoth, mastodon, bison. Their points are found across North America, but DNA and archaeology have demolished the Clovis first model. The Clovis people were not the first Americans. They were late arrivals. Monte Verde in Chile, 14,800 years old, over 1,000 years before Clovis. Humans were already in southern Chile before the Clovis culture even existed in North America. Tom Dilhay excavated Monte Verde over decades. His pre-Clovis dates were attacked for years before being accepted. The Clovis first establishment fought the evidence for decades. The data eventually won. The Clovis first model was defended for 50 years. Careers were built on it. Careers were destroyed by challenging it. White Sands, New Mexico. Human footprints dated to 23,000 years ago. 10,000 years before Clovis. The first Americans were walking in New Mexico while the last ice age was still at its peak. Multiple laboratories confirmed the dates independently. 23,000 years. Not debatable. Accelerator mass spectrometry, the most precise dating technology available. The dates held. The textbook said 13,000 years. The footprints say 23,000. The gap is enormous. And then ancient DNA revealed how the founding population split. Once south of the ice, the founding population divided into at least two major branches. A northern branch that populated most of North America, and a southern branch that reached Central and South America. The split happened quickly. Within a few centuries, the two branches were thousands of kilometers apart. The Pacific coast route was faster. Open coastline with no barriers. The interior route faced mountains and forests. The coastal route offered food at every step. The interior route required crossing glaciers. The northern branch diversified into Athabascan, Algonquian, and Siouan-speaking populations. The southern into Mayan, Quechua, and Tupi. The southern branch moved fast. Within 2,000 years of entering the Americas, humans had reached Patagonia, 16 kilometers per year. The fastest documented colonization of a continent in human history. From Alaska to Patagonia in 2,000 years. An entire hemisphere colonized in 80 generations. The oldest complete ancient genome from the Americas confirmed the founding story. Anzac I, a Clovis-era infant buried in Montana roughly 12,600 years ago. His genome proved he was ancestral to all modern Central and South American indigenous populations, buried with Clovis tools and covered in red ochre, the same burial customs found across the early Americas. Red ochre burial, the oldest continuous funerary tradition in the Americas. And he carried zero European ancestry. The Solutrean hypothesis, which claimed Ice Age Europeans had crossed the Atlantic, was demolished. Anzac I proved the first Americans came from Asia, not from Europe. The debate was over. Then came Kennewick Man, a 9,000-year-old skeleton found in Washington state in 1996. Physical anthropologists initially claimed his skull looked European. White supremacists seized on the claim. DNA in 2015 proved he was Native American, related to the Colville tribes. Zero European ancestry. The racial classification had been wrong. Skull shape does not predict genetic origin. Craniometrics failed where genetics succeeded. The shape of a skull cannot predict ancestry. 5 skulls, 5 wrong predictions. DNA proved craniometrics unreliable for ancestry. He was repatriated to the tribes and buried with ceremony. DNA gave him back to his people. But the DNA story is not just about who arrived first. It is about how many people were already here. The Americas were not empty. Genetic diversity data suggests 60 to 100 million people lived here before 1492. The Amazon alone may have supported 10 million people. They built roads, bridges, and modified the forest itself. Genetic diversity in pre-contact populations was enormous. Thousands of distinct populations across 2 continents. Over 1,000 distinct languages, each one representing centuries of genetic isolation and drift. More linguistic diversity than all of Europe combined. Each language family a genetic island. 15,000 years of isolation created more linguistic diversity than anywhere else on Earth. Civilizations from the Arctic to the Andes, each genetically distinct, all descending from the same founding group. Then European contact triggered the greatest genetic catastrophe in human history. Smallpox, measles, influenza. Diseases the indigenous population had no immunity to. 90% population decline within a century. Tens of millions of people dead. Ancient DNA from pre-contact and post-contact burials shows the genetic bottleneck directly. Entire mitochondrial lineages that existed for thousands of years disappeared within a few generations. Genetic lineages that survived 15,000 years of ice ages were erased in 1 century of contact. The survivors carried only a fraction of the original genetic diversity. And then European, African, and Asian genes entered the Americas in massive waves. The transatlantic slave trade brought 12 million Africans to the Americas. the largest forced migration in human history. Brazil alone received over 4 million enslaved Africans. The genetic impact was permanent. Salvador, Bahia. The African genetic contribution here exceeds 50%, the highest in the Americas. European colonists brought their own genes from every corner of Europe. Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, Dutch. The result was the most genetically complex population mixture in human history. Modern Latin America is a three-way genetic mixture: indigenous, European, and African. In every country, the proportions vary by country, but the three-way mixture is universal across Latin America. Mexico averages roughly 50% indigenous, 40% European, and 5% African. Southern Mexico is more indigenous. Northern Mexico is more European. Geography shaped the blending. One country, two genetic realities. The colonial settlement pattern still visible in the DNA. Mexico City, 22 million people, each carrying a unique ratio of 3 continents. Brazil averages roughly 40% European, 40% African, and 10% indigenous. But here is what most people miss. The indigenous DNA did not disappear. It was diluted, but it survived. In the Andes and the Amazon, indigenous communities still carry over 90% Native American ancestry. The Quechua people, over 10 million strong, carrying the highest proportion of founding American DNA, 95% founding ancestry, 15,000 years of genetic continuity in one living population. The founding lineages that crossed Beringia 15,000 years ago still flow in millions of living people. And there is one more genetic surprise: contact with Polynesia. DNA evidence published in 2020 proved that Polynesians and South Americans made contact around 1200 CE. Polynesian and Native American DNA mixed 400 years before Columbus was born. The closest genetic match was to the Zenu people of Colombia. The contact point was likely the Pacific coast of South America. The sweet potato, a South American crop, was already being grown in Polynesia centuries before European contact. The DNA now explains how the sweet potato could not have crossed the Pacific alone. Someone carried it. Polynesian navigators crossed the Pacific. The DNA and the sweet potato prove the same story. So what is the full genetic story of the Americas? It is a story of isolation, explosion, catastrophe, and mixing. Phase 1, 25,000 years of isolation in Beringia. The founding population forming, 25,000 years, long enough to develop every genetic marker unique to Native Americans. 5 mitochondrial haplogroups. Every indigenous American carries one of them. Phase 2, rapid colonization of 2 continents in under 3,000 years. A continent with no human competitors. Megafauna that had never seen a human predator. Giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, American horses, all extinct within centuries of human arrival. A hemisphere of resources, no competition. The population exploded. Phase 3, 15,000 years of diversification and population growth. 60 to 100 million people, from a few thousand to 100 million in 15,000 years. The most successful colonization in human history. Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, population 20,000 at its peak. From a founding group of a few thousand to cities of hundreds of thousands, all from the same genetic seed. The Nazca Lines, created by people whose ancestors walked across a frozen land bridge. Phase 4, post-Columbian catastrophe. 90% collapse followed by the most complex genetic mixing event ever. 4 phases, 25,000 years, and the founding DNA still survives. Every indigenous American alive carries DNA from the same small group that lived on the land bridge. A few thousand people, 2 continents, 25,000 years, and the story is still being written. The land bridge is gone. The ice is gone. The people remain. From the Arctic to Patagonia, The founding DNA endures 25,000 years of genetic history, written in the DNA of 500 million people. If the Americas were populated from one small group, what does that say about how connected all humans really are? Sources in the description. Subscribe if you want to see what DNA reveals next. Tell me in the comments which continent's genetic history you want investigated next.